Good morning. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, here's Laura with today's announcements.
Good morning. Guess what today is? 2 days before break. I hope tomorrow, when it's 1 day before break, you're more excited. Today's Thursday, February 22nd, and it's a green day. Tomorrow is the deadline for registering for the PSAT 10, or SAT. Please say Mrs. Carr with any questions. Attention varsity tennis players. There will be an informational meeting for those interested in playing varsity tennis this spring today at 3:30 in Streeter 248. If you are currently participating in a team sport and can't make the meeting, please contact Dr. Sayrath in the science department. Don't forget, the Human Services class item drive is a great way to win a yummy basket of goodies. The advisory that donates the most items to support our community service project, working with people experiencing homelessness, will win. Diapers, wipes, and pet food are our top choices, followed by hygiene products. Drop boxes can be found outside of Streeter 225 or in the faculty mailroom. Happy birthday today to Caleb Gilly and Julian McGuire. Happy birthday. Today we have JV and varsity girls basketball versus Mount Mansfield, 5:30 and 7, and girls JVB basketball at Montpelier, 5:30. Please release the team at 3 o'clock. Thank you and have a great Thursday.
Thank you, Laura. Our late announcements for today. At the Alpine Northern District Alpine Championships, the boys team placed third and the girls team placed fifth. Edwin Stevenson led the boys with a 6th place finish, while Macy Moore led the girls with a 16th place finish. Congratulations to both of those teams. Boys varsity hockey beat Milton 4-3 last night. Memphis Mastine, Evan Windrow, Sebastian Ahonen, and Connor Brigham scored for the Hilltoppers. Nate Delman had 35 saves in net. Coach Windrow would like to thank seniors Nate Cushing, Holden Newland, Eli Rexford, and Sebastian Ahonen for their hard work and dedication this season. Congratulations, boys hockey. Now, as we continue Black History Month, it's my pleasure to turn the stage over to Mr. Quinn. Please welcome Mr. Quinn.
Good morning. I'm Mr. Quinn. I'm a teacher in the Social Studies Department. I teach humanities and U.S. history, and next year we'll be offering a new elective in an AP African American Studies course. If you're interested, you should come talk to me. But today I'm here to talk about some historical methods and what we know about sort of average 19th century Black people. When we look at 19th century Americans in general, we know almost nothing about what average people did or said or thought, because very, very little of it is recorded and saved in archives. Not many of those people wrote well, not many of them had the resources to do so, or even thought that others would actually care about what they thought, and then little of what was written down was actually saved by historians. And that's even more true of 19th century Black Americans. The most widely known writings of 19th century Black people were written for a white audience. And they're phenomenal works of rhetoric. They're arguing for an end to slavery, but in many ways they're actually much more about whiteness than they are about Blackness. Because what these people are doing, these authors, when they're writing these books, is they are imagining what aspects of the Black experience they could be told to white people in ways that would persuade them that slavery was bad. So, for example, when Harriet Jacobs writes her Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl, which is the most widely read book by a black woman of the 19th century. She couldn't even call herself a woman in the title of her book because to most white people, they didn't think that a black person could ever become fully an adult human being. So even right there in the title of her book, she's packaging herself for an audience that doesn't see her as fully human. Similarly, when Frederick Douglass was writing his first slave narrative, he talks about one of his core arguments against slavery is that slavery is bad because it makes good white women bad. Just sure an argument against slavery, but maybe not the core one. Both of these people are using white values of the time, something in this case called the cult of true womanhood, to make these persuasive arguments against slavery. And they're both examples of what W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness, which is looking at oneself through the eyes of others, a measure of one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. So, how do we know what 19th century black people said to one another? How did they talk about blackness, about slavery, about their communities? These are much harder questions to answer, and they require resources that are much less often saved. They often require imagination and careful understanding of background and reading between the lines. And after the Civil War, black newspapers began popping up in the Deep South, and all of them had sections called Lost Friends or something like that, a part of the newspaper where anyone could place an ad looking for a lost loved one. And for most of the 19th century, these were people looking for people lost during slavery, who'd been stolen by enslavers, who'd been gambled on by spectators, who've been moved from one end of the country to another by other humans hoping to enrich themselves. One of the very first of these, and I apologize, this is the best image that I have of this. It's a little blurry, so I'll read it to you. This is from the Colored Tennessean, which began publication in 1865. And here, Lucinda Lowry writes, "Information wanted of Caroline Dodson, who was sold from Nashville, Tennessee, November 1st, 1862, by James Lumsden of Warwick, a trader then in human beings, who carried her to Atlanta, Georgia, and she was last heard of in the sail pen of Robert Clark, a human trader in that place, from which she was sold. Any information of her whereabouts will be thankfully received by her mother, Lucinda Lowry." Ms. Lowry refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of enslavers here, right? She's pointedly calling them human traders. And she's managed to trace her daughter across literally hundreds of miles during the Civil War, and literally across enemy lines in wartime, trying to find information about her child. And 3 years later, she's still searching, hopeful of finding her child. Literally thousands upon thousands of these sorts of ads exist. They show us not only how black 19th century people talked to one another, but also about the vast social networks that the black community created, despite a lack of resources, despite having been barred from education, despite the violence and the terrorism that was directed at them. Right? In fact, when Lucinda Lowry's name first appears in a public record in 1870, she's listed as being unable to write, and yet she manages to write this. I wanted to spend a couple minutes doing a close reading of one of these ads. It's from the Southwestern Christian Advocate, a newspaper that was supported by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The Advocate had one of the widest circulations of any black newspaper in the Deep South, and it's one of the best preserved. And to help spread the news beyond just the people who were literate, which was a really narrow segment of the population, these were read as part of church services throughout the South. So this ad appears in March of 1820. Lucy Clark placed this ad, and when I first encountered it, it stayed with me because of just how unbearably sad it is. But the more I looked at it, the more I saw tremendous hope and love that's lingering between these lines. So Lucy Clark writes, "Dear editor, please allow me to make inquiry of my mother, Nancy Love. We were separated in the year 1850 in Mississippi. I was then but an infant of 9 months. We belonged to Anderson Moss. He sold my mother to Ned Herndon, a speculator in slaves. He sold her to Mrs. Hooker, a widow in Jackson, Mississippi. It was then that I heard from her last, about the year 1853. My mother wrote to Miss Love Moss to ask her as to her whereabouts, as to any information relative to her will be very thankfully received." And then it has her address and Lucy Clark. The story that Lucy Clark tells is all too common. Parents and children, even infants, were routinely stolen from one another during slavery. Like most of these ads, Lucy Clark lists as many names, dates, and places as she possibly can. But wait, how is it that Lucy Clark knows any of this? 27 years ago, she was 3 or 4 years old when her mother wrote to say that she was in Jackson, Mississippi. Clearly, Lucy was not reading that letter. Oh dear. There we go. How is it that Lucy Clark even knows her mother's name? How is it that Lucy Clark survived being separated from her mother at such a young age? Mississippi slave labor camps were utterly brutal places. Enslaved people worked from before dawn to after dusk. Enslavers intentionally tried to separate families from one another to make sure that there weren't any close ties within the communities that they enslaved. And children as young as 18 months were put to work out in the fields. And babies born in these camps often had about a 50-50 chance of surviving to their first birthday. So how is it that Lucy Clark survived without a mother? She says that Nancy Love wrote in 1853. She wrote at a time when enslaved people were pretty significantly barred from being able to learn how to read or write. So how is any of this possible? We know from oral histories that enslaved people throughout the South taught one another how to read and write in secret, often in the dark, or often on Sunday mornings when their slavers were away at church. Some even created pit schools, literally schools that were dug in a pit in the ground, deep in the woods, and the pit would protect the people hiding in that school at night from their light giving them away to the slave patrols. Maybe Nancy Love was one of those people who snuck away under cover of darkness to jump into a pit that was also a school to learn how to read. We only know that somehow she managed to learn how to both read and write. But how is it possible that Lucy Clark even knows that this letter existed? We don't know the precise mechanism. This is, I think, the only thing that we have, the only artifact from Lucy Clark's life. But the answer is community, and it's love, and it's hope. Someone cared for Lucy Clark before she could walk or talk or feed herself. They carried her, they clothed her, and they made sure that she knew every piece of information that exists here, hoping that someday that information would matter, because someday Lucy Clark would live in freedom and try to find her mother. I want you to take a moment and imagine Lucy Clark's call for her mother being read on a Sunday morning in a church, in a room much humbler than this one, much smaller, to a group of people gathered, listening and hoping. Help me to find my people. Imagine people sitting in the pews, rolling through all of the people and the places that they had ever known or heard of. Could they help? Did they remember? Did they know? Each bringing with them their knowledge and memories to help them restitch the bonds of family and community that had been torn again and again and again by violence. I cannot tell you if Lucy Clark ever found her mother. I can tell you that 10 years after she wrote this, she was living in the home of a white family in Texas, doing their cooking and cleaning. She seems never to have had children of her own, and as far as I know, this ad is the only record of her existence in her own words that exists. I can tell you, though, that Lucinda Lowry found her daughter. The historian Heather Williams traced Lucinda Lowry, and this is an 1870 census record, and yeah, it's written in very fancy cursive, so even if it was big enough, you probably would have some trouble reading it. I do myself. But 5 years after she placed her ad looking for her daughter is living with her again in Nashville, Tennessee, as is a son, and Lucinda Lowry is working she's a housekeeper. In other words, she's comfortable enough to not have to work outside the home. Her daughter's working as a seamstress, and there's another person who's about 30 years younger than her who shares her last name, a young man who's listed as working as an engineer. Some of these people did find one another. What I want you to take from this is knowing that each one of us is stronger than we need to be, that we can lift one another up, that we can live in hope and in love, knowing that probably we're going to fail over and over and over again, and yet return to that hope and that love and keep reaching out to restitch the bonds of our communities. And I want to leave you imagining the joy in this church in Houston, Texas, on a Sunday morning in 1877. Someone writes to the Southwestern saying, "We published in this column a letter from Charity Thompson of Hawkins, Texas, making an inquiry about her family. She last heard of them in Alabama years ago. The letter, as printed in the paper, was read in the First Church, Houston, and as the reading proceeded, a well-known member of the church, Mrs. Dibble, burst into tears and cried out, 'That is my sister, and I have not seen her for 33 years. Their mother is still living, and in a few days, the happy family will be once more reunited.'" Thank you.
Mr. Quinn, thank you. Thank you for sharing Lucy Clark's history, for helping us to begin to understand our collective history, to be pushed to consider what it means to be a community with a rich and oftentimes difficult to accept history. So thank you again for sharing with us this morning. I want to mention two things that were two comments from Monday's chapel as we close today. The first comment, our guest speaker said to us as she stepped on stage, she said, "I'm going to make you feel a bit uncomfortable." That was an important comment, and indeed, hearing from faculty members around campus, I know that there were lots of comments that were shared. There were things that we wrestled with together. We had some good conversations, and that's what Dr. Howell closed with on Monday. She said, there's lots more to discuss. And so the thing I want to raise up and highlight is as we wrestle with history and as we wrestle with perspectives that we might be taking on board and we have to reconcile those perspectives together, I hope we do, and I expect that we will, have civil discourse around those, and that we'll work on those things together. So I'm gonna speak more on civil discourse after the break, but I'm hoping that that's something that we can all commit to, that we can, even in disagreements, even as we wrestle, if comments are opinion that you hear from stage, or if they're fact and we're wrestling with them, I hope we sit down together and that we have those conversations in a polite and kind way, and that we work to understand each other's perspectives. So again, thank you, Mr. Quinn, for the great talk today, for hearing about our collective history. I hope you have a wonderful Thursday. Faculty.